What if the moment you returned from war, the truth waiting for you was far darker than the battlefield you left behind? David found his father's farm burned and the town calling it an accident. But why did his father's loyal dog refuse to leave the ashes? Why did Max keep staring at the same cracked concrete as if something underneath was still speaking? And if a dog senses danger long before humans do, what was he trying to warn David about? This story follows a son, a loyal companion, and the mystery that changed an entire community. I hope you enjoy this meaningful and powerful journey. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The late afternoon sky hung low over the small Idaho Valley as pale light spread across the rolling fields. The air was dry and cold, with a thin breeze pushing dust in long drifting trails across the road. The colors of the land were muted and tired, as if the earth itself had not rested in years. In that quiet setting, a lone pickup truck moved slowly along the narrow gravel path, leading toward a burned and abandoned farm at the far end of the valley. Inside, the truck sat David Cooper, a man of about 40 years old, hardened by 2 decades of military service. His face was angular and weathered with the kind of lines that came from sleepless nights and heavy responsibilities. His hair was dark brown, touched with strands of early gray that framed a tense and focused expression. His eyes steadied on the ruined horizon, a shade of deep brown that had once held warmth, but now carried exhaustion and a silent ache. His beard was short and rough, a sign that he had been traveling for days without caring about his appearance. David had returned from deployment only a week earlier, but his heart had not yet found a place to belong. After years of war, he had become a man who moved with caution, a habit formed through loss and danger that never left him fully. As he approached the land he once called home, an uneasy heaviness settled inside his chest. He felt the familiar tightening in his throat, the same feeling he used to get before stepping into uncertain terrain during military missions. But this was different. This was not a battlefield. This was his home, or at least what remained of it. The truck rolled to a stop, and the engine fell silent, leaving only the whisper of wind brushing past the charred skeletons of what had once been buildings. David stepped out slowly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Before him stood the remains of the Cooper farm, the place where he had grown up under the guidance of his father, a man known for his steady hands and quiet discipline. Now, what remained was ash-twisted metal and scattered debris. The main house had collapsed in on itself, forming a black pit of burned wood and broken beams. The barn behind it was nothing more than a row of scorched posts, leaning like tired soldiers, unable to stand any longer. A faint smell of smoke still lingered, though the fire had happened weeks before. David walked forward each step, echoing with memories of childhood mornings and late harvest nights. But the warmth of those memories felt distant, soaked by grief and disbelief. According to the short letter he had received from the county office, his father had died in a fire described as an unfortunate accident. The report said the blaze had started at night, spreading quickly through the old wooden structure. No further explanation, no clear cause, only the word accident written with cold indifference. David had read the letter 10 times through the long bus ride home, stunned by how easily a life could be summarized by a single vague sentence. His father, Robert Cooper, had been a man of strong character, tall with broad shoulders and careful movements shaped by decades of farm labor. His hands had always been rough, yet gentle, and his voice deep but calm. He had raised David alone after the loss of David's mother and taught him the values of hard work and integrity. The idea that such a careful man could perish in a simple accident echoed strangely in David's mind. He crouched near the remains of the house, letting his fingers touch the cold ash. The emptiness settled deeper, the kind that felt like a hollow room inside his chest. He wondered what the final moments of his father had been like. He wondered if someone had been there, if anyone had tried to help, or if Robert Cooper had died alone in the dark with no voice strong enough to call for aid. As the thoughts pressed down on him, David exhaled long and slow, trying to steady his breath. His grief was raw, but beneath it lay a sharp thread of confusion. Something felt wrong, though he could not yet form the thought fully. As he stood again, scanning the ruins, a faint movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. He turned quickly, instinct guiding him, as it had so many times in the field. At first, he saw nothing but blackened beams and overgrown grass, but then a soft rustling emerged from behind a collapsed fence. David stepped closer, his footsteps measured. From the shadows, a shape slowly crept forward. A German shepherd emerged thin, trembling, and covered in dust. The dog looked to be about 6 or 7 years old, its coat originally a rich mix of black and tan, now dull and matted from weeks of survival. Its ribs were faintly visible from hunger, and its ears pressed back, not in aggression, but in fear and uncertainty. Yet in its eyes, there was recognition. David knelt slowly in the dirt, lowering his posture in a gesture of peace. The dog's tail flicked once in hesitation. He studied it closely, remembering. This was Max, the loyal dog his father had raised before David left for deployment. Max had been energetic, strong, and protective, always following Robert around the fields. But the dog before him now was a shadow of that former self. His gaze was sharp, though haunted. There was intelligence lingering there, and something else, a worry that went deeper than hunger. David reached out his hand, slowly, palm open. Max did not come closer, but he did not run either. His body trembled in cautious fear, but his eyes never left the burned foundation behind David. It was as if the dog was trying to look past him, trying to draw attention to something important. David felt his heart tighten with both sorrow and confusion. He spoke softly, his voice low and steady, the way he used to soothe frightened civilians during missions. "It is all right, boy. You are safe now." Max shifted his weight, uncertain, then took a small step forward, nose twitching as he studied the familiar scent of David. Another step followed, then he stopped again, his gaze pulling away from the man and returning insistently toward a corner of the burned foundation. David turned to look, but the area seemed ordinary, a patch of scorched concrete and scattered debris, no different from the rest. Yet Max continued to stare, tail lifted slightly, ears halfway raised. There was something behind those eyes, something silent and urgent. David felt a flicker of unease. He had seen that expression before during patrols overseas, when a trained dog detected something hidden beneath the surface of the ground or sensed danger unseen by human eyes. Max let out a soft whine deep in his throat, then looked back at David as if pleading for him to understand. David knelt again, and for the first time, Max moved close enough to press his nose gently into David's hand. The small gesture stirred a warmth in David's chest. He stroked the dog's head, slowly feeling the roughness of his fur and the tremble beneath his skin. "You have been through a lot, boy," he whispered. "Me too." The sun dipped lower, and shadows grew across the torn land, but Max remained tense, his eyes drifting again toward the concrete slab, as if he could not forget what lay there. David stood quietly beside the dog, sensing that the heaviness of this place held more than grief. It held questions. It held silence that felt too thick, too deliberate. The accident report lingered in his thoughts, pressed now by the strange behavior of the dog who had survived when his father had not. David looked out across the ruined land, feeling the sting of loss, but also the first spark of a thought that unsettled him. Something about the story was not right. As he placed a hand gently on Mac's back, he felt the dog lean into him just slightly. In that small moment of fragile trust, David understood that this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened here, the answers had not been burned away. They were waiting buried somewhere in the ash, somewhere beneath the silent ground that Max refused to ignore. The morning air in the Idaho Valley was cool and still, with a thin layer of mist drifting low across the ground as the early light rose over the worn landscape. The sky was pale and quiet, holding a gentle chill that hinted at a change in the weather. In that calm and muted dawn, David Cooper stood beside an old metal warehouse, the place he now called home, though it felt more like a shelter than anything permanent. The structure was a rectangular shell of rusted steel, with dents and faded paint showing its age. Inside, it was empty and echoing with only a few old tools scattered on the floor. David had been living here since the day he returned to find the farm destroyed. It was the only building on the land that had survived the fire, and even then, only barely. David pushed open the creaking door, carrying a small bag of groceries he had bought with the little money he earned from temporary work. He had taken on any job the town offered, unloading supply trucks, sweeping storage lots, repairing fences for people who hardly spoke to him. He did the work without complaint because he needed enough to eat and enough to take care of Max. Max sat near the doorway, watching him with sharp eyes, filled with loyalty and worry. The German shepherd moved closer, sniffing the bag, then looking up at David with a soft whine. The dog was gaining strength, though he still looked thin. His fur was beginning to shine again under David's care, but his ribs were faintly visible, and his movements carried the stiffness of exhaustion from weeks of surviving alone. David crouched and brushed his hand along Mac's back, feeling the tension beneath the rough fur. "You will be all right, boy," he murmured. "We both will." But even as he said it, his chest felt heavy with doubt. Life after the military was already difficult, and now, with the fire and the loss of his father, the weight of reality pressed harder every day. He had come home, hoping to find a place to rebuild, but instead, he had stepped into a storm of suspicion and whispered judgment. When he went into town for work, people stared at him in ways they never had before. Some offered quick nods that felt forced, while others avoided his eyes completely, as if he carried a shadow they did not want to stand near. The general store clerk, a middle-aged man named Harvey, had served him with a stiff, awkward politeness each time. Harvey was a short man with a round face, thinning blonde hair, and hands that trembled slightly when he counted change. His eyes always shifted away from David, as if searching for someone else to handle the interaction. David sensed discomfort, but never confronted it. The weight of grief had made him quiet and inward. and he was already too tired to challenge the unspoken distrust around him. Yet he understood why the suspicion lingered. A veteran returning home to a burned property and an insurance case made for easy rumors. The insurance company had sent him a letter filled with cold questions and hints that they doubted his version of events. They had asked what his father had been doing the night of the fire, and whether David had any reason to believe the blaze had started naturally. There was a tone between the lines, a tone that suggested they were looking at him as a possible cause or beneficiary. The pressure grew each day, pressing against the sadness that already felt overwhelming. At night, the quiet inside the warehouse became a companion, but also a reminder of everything he had lost. The old metal walls echoed every movement, and the air smelled faintly of rust and dust. He slept on a thin mattress on the floor, wrapped in an old blanket, and used his backpack as a pillow. Max slept close to him, curled near his side, though the dog sometimes woke, suddenly trembling, or pacing in the dark. Something about the nights unsettled Max, but David did not know why. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the warehouse was filled with orange and fading light. David sat against the wall, eating a small meal of canned soup, while Max rested at the open door. The dog lifted his head, suddenly ears alert. Then Max barked a short, sharp warning. David set the can aside and stood. Max barked again, louder this time, and bolted outside into the cooling air. David followed him, stepping onto the dry grass, where the wind carried a faint, cold bite. Max ran toward the ruins of the old house, halted near a broken section of foundation, and stared intensely at one specific area of scorched concrete. His tail was stiff, his body leaning forward as if expecting something to rise from the ground. David approached slowly, his boots crunching on bits of burnt wood. He stopped beside Max and examined the spot. It was nothing more than a slab of blackened concrete cracked by heat and time, the same as the rest of the foundation. He knelt, running his hand along its rough surface. There was no difference, no sign of movement, no unusual marks. Yet Max continued to stare at it, his ears angled forward, fur slightly raised along his neck. The dog let out a low, deep growl, then turned to look at David with an expression that felt strangely close to pleading. David touched the ground again, searching more carefully. He lifted small fragments of burned wood, brushed away loose ash, and inspected the cracks, but everything seemed ordinary. He sat back, feeling confusion mixed with concern. "What are you trying to show me, boy?" he whispered. Max circled the area, sniffing every inch with restless urgency. Then he barked again, a short, frustrated sound, and pawed lightly at the slab, though he did not scratch or dig. It was as if he wanted David to understand, but could not force himself to touch the place. David watched him closely, noting the tension in the dog's body, the mixture of fear and need. Max eventually retreated a few steps, still staring fixedly at the foundation. David felt a chill settle in his chest. The dog had survived the fire. He had been here the night it happened. He had seen something, or sensed something, but David did not have enough information, not yet. The night deepened, and they returned to the warehouse. David tried to sleep, but Max kept getting up, pacing in circles near the door, then returning to stare out toward the ruins. Each time he lay down, his ears remained perked, listening for something David could not hear. As dawn approached, David felt the weight of uncertainty growing heavier inside him. He trusted Max, but he could not understand him. and he could not ignore the unease that grew every time the dog looked toward the foundation, as if something there refused to rest. Over the next days, the pattern repeated itself. David worked odd jobs to keep himself afloat, and people continued to speak to him with a stiffness that suggested they wished he would leave. At night, Max always returned to that same corner of the burned land, barking toward the foundation, sometimes softly, sometimes sharply, but always with the same intense focus. David could not explain it, and that made the feeling worse. It was like walking in the dark, with a faint sound trailing behind him just beyond reach. By the end of the week, the suspicion from the town and the persistent behavior from Max carved a deeper silence into David. He stood alone in the warehouse doorway one evening, watching the shadows stretch across the land. Max sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the ruins. David felt a tightening in his stomach, the same feeling he had felt before entering dangerous terrain overseas. Something was hidden here. Something was waiting beneath the surface, even if he could not see it yet, and Max could not let it go. The dog knew something, and that silent knowledge created a knot of tension that David could not ignore. As night fell, he placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the unspoken bond between them. Whatever lay ahead, this was only the beginning, and he sensed that the truth was buried deeper than the ashes on the ground. The rain arrived before sunset, moving across the Idaho Valley in long silver sheets that blurred the distant hills and softened every shape under the darkening sky. The air grew heavy and cold, carrying the scent of wet soil and burnt timber. Thunder rolled far away, like a slow reminder of storms that once frightened David Cooper as a child, but now only pressed against his exhausted mind. He stood inside the metal warehouse, watching the rain slide across the open doorway. His breath felt tight with the weight of confusion and unanswered questions that grew heavier each day. Max lay near the door, but the dog was restless, shifting his paws, pushing his nose into the air as if testing the coming storm. His fur glistened with droplets carried by the wind, and his posture had changed from caution to a nervous alertness that David did not understand. The rain intensified, hitting the ground in hard rhythmic beats. Lightning flashed faintly beyond the hills, and Max suddenly stood, his muscles stiff and his ears pointed directly toward the ruins of the burned house. David noticed the change immediately. He set aside the small tool he had been cleaning and moved to Max's side. The dog let out a sharp bark, followed by a low tremor in his throat. Then, without waiting, Max bolted out into the rain, his paws splashing through puddles as he ran with an urgency that startled David. David grabbed his coat and followed him, the cold rain stinging his skin as he stepped outside. The ground was slick, the ash dampened into dark streaks across the soil. Max ran directly toward the collapsed foundation where he had barked so many nights before. But tonight was different. The rain and wind seemed to push him faster, pulling him toward something hidden beneath the cracked surface. David reached the ruins, his boots heavy with mud. Max was already at the foundation, pawing furiously at the concrete, his claws scraping sharply against the wet surface. The sound cut through the storm in rapid, uneven bursts. David knelt beside him, the cold water soaking through his pants as he watched the dog focus on a small, narrow line running across the slab. It was a thin crack, but Max treated it with a level of intensity that made David's chest tighten. He placed a hand on the concrete, feeling the chill. The crack looked deeper than the others, and as he traced the line with his fingers, He sensed a faint, unnatural straightness to it. It did not follow the chaotic pattern of heat fractures from the fire. Instead, it looked almost cut. His pulse quickened. He brushed away loose ash and debris, clearing the surface around the crack. The edges were too smooth, too deliberate. That realization hit him with a slow, cold force. David tapped the ground lightly, listening for hollow differences. He heard a faint change in tone, subtle, but present. Max barked again, pressing his nose to the crack before pulling back, as if urging David to understand. David felt the urgency rising within him. His father had always been a careful man. If he had hidden something, it would be in a place that appeared ordinary. The foundation made sense. The storm rumbled overhead as David hurried back to the warehouse to retrieve a metal pry bar he had found among the old tools. When he returned, Max was still pacing anxiously, tail-stiff ears pinned forward. David wedged the pry bar into the line of the crack and pushed, using his weight to create leverage. The concrete resisted at first, then with a grinding sound, it began to shift. Max barked loudly, his excitement rising as the slab tilted slightly, revealing a dark gap beneath. David gripped the edge of the concrete and pulled with steady force, lifting it enough to slide it aside. Beneath the slab lay a rectangular metal object covered in soot and faint scorch marks. It was a fireproof safe, heavy and worn, but still intact. David stared at it, his breath caught halfway between dread and hope. Max moved closer, sniffing the edges of the safe, then sitting down, as if guarding it. David touched the metal, feeling its cold surface. He knew his father well enough to recognize the intention behind this. His father had placed something here, something he believed needed protection from fire or from people. David located the small combination dial at the front, though the numbers were almost unreadable under layers of soot. He hesitated. His father had kept few secrets in life, but this was clearly something important. The sound of rain softened slightly as he turned the dial, carefully trying the numbers that held meaning to his father. It took several attempts and several breaths of frustration, but finally the lock clicked open with a soft, mechanical release. The lid lifted with a faint metallic creak. Inside the safe, everything looked untouched by flame or time. Papers lay stacked neatly, their edges slightly yellowed but dry. A thin notebook was placed on top, filled with his father's handwriting, recognizable in its steady, clean strokes. Beneath it rested a small silver USB drive, scratched along the edges, but clearly functional. David lifted the notebook first, flipping through several pages. The writing was dense and detailed, full of dates, soil measurements, and observations he could not fully interpret. His father had been documenting something connected to the land perhaps, or to the farm operations. But none of it was clear. There were no statements that explained the fire, no warning written, plainly no final message. The information was scattered like pieces of a puzzle without the center picture. He set the notebook aside and picked up the USB. It felt heavier than it looked, the weight pressing into his palm like a question left hanging in the air. Max moved closer, nudging David's arm with his nose. David looked down into the dog's intelligent eyes and saw a reflection of uncertainty mixed with trust. Whatever this was, Max had led him to it. That thought tightened something inside his chest. The rain eased into a steady drizzle as David sat beside the open safe, his body soaked, but his mind sharper than it had been since returning home. He examined the papers again, but the meaning of the notes refused to settle. Everything was scattered, without context, He needed time to understand, but time did not promise answers. His father had hidden these items for a reason, but that reason was still buried behind layers of silence. David closed the safe gently and pulled it closer to him, protecting its contents. He looked across the ruined foundation, the rain sliding down the cracked concrete. Max sat beside him, tail wrapped around his paws, watching with a calm, steady presence. David felt the weight of uncertainty deepen inside him. He had found something important, but it was not clarity, not yet. It was only the first layer beneath the ashes, a quiet whisper of the truth, but not the truth itself. As he rose to his feet, Max followed him, his body brushing lightly against David's leg, as if grounding him. David looked once more at the place where the safe had rested, hidden beneath the concrete. The questions grew louder in his mind, but the answers remained just beyond reach. In the soft mist of the fading storm, he felt the first hint of determination forming in his heart. This discovery was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. And Max had been the one to show him where to look. The morning was cool and clear, with a faint veil of clouds drifting slowly across the Idaho sky. A soft wind carried the scent of damp soil left from the rainfall the night before, and the sun rose gently over the valley, giving the land a pale, muted glow. David Cooper stood outside the metal warehouse, feeling the weight of the fireproof safe in his hands, and the heavier weight of confusion sitting deep inside his chest. He had spent half the night reading through the scattered notes and brief observations his father had left behind, but nothing connected fully. Each page felt like a fragment of a larger story that refused to reveal its shape. Max stayed close to him, the German shepherd, watching his every movement with steady, alert eyes. The dog seemed calmer that morning, but still carried a lingering tension in his posture, as if the discovery beneath the concrete had confirmed something only he had sensed. David dropped his gaze to the safe again and knew he needed help. The notebook and the USB were beyond his understanding. The notes mentioned soil changes and irregular patterns, but the handwriting grew rushed and uneven, in places even burned along the edges by flame or heat. If his father had been trying to warn someone, he had not been able to complete the message. David locked the warehouse door and stepped into his truck, Max climbing into the passenger seat with a soft grunt. The town of Murphy was quiet as he drove in the tires rolling steadily over the gravel road. The small wooden buildings lining the main street looked worn but familiar, and the crisp morning light gave the place a calmness that eased his nerves slightly. He parked outside the office of Sarah Whitman, an older attorney who had known his family for decades. Sarah was in her early 70s, a tall, thin woman with silver hair tied neatly at the back and skin lined gently with age. Her eyes were a soft gray, steady and perceptive, with the quiet firmness of someone who had worked through difficult cases and lived through difficult times. She carried herself with dignity, moving slowly but deliberately, her posture straight despite her age. David entered the office, with Max staying close beside him. Sarah looked up from her desk, her expression shifting into a warm but worried recognition. "David Cooper," she said in a low, measured voice, "I heard about your father. I am truly sorry." Her voice carried sincerity, and David felt a small sense of reassurance. "Thank you," he replied quietly. "I could use your help with something." Sarah gestured for him to sit. Max lay at his feet, resting his head on his paws, but keeping his eyes open as if evaluating the safety of the room. David placed the safe on the desk and pulled out the notebook, and USB. Sarah put on her glasses, studying the objects with careful, slow movements. "Where did you find these, David?" she asked. "Beneath the foundation," he said. "My father hid them." Sarah opened the notebook, flipping through the burned and uneven pages. Her brows drew together in concentration. "This is not simple bookkeeping," she murmured. "These are observations, measurements, soil conditions." Something was troubling him. David nodded, his jaw tightening. "I cannot understand all of it. Some pages are missing or burned." Sarah paused over a line, mentioning Greenfields, the large company specializing in agricultural chemicals. David waited, watching her reaction closely. Sarah inhaled slowly, then closed the notebook. "Greenfields has been expanding aggressively," she said. "They push their products hard. They promise high yields and fast results. But some farmers have raised concerns, though nothing official." David leaned forward. "Do you think this has anything to do with the fire?" Sarah hesitated, taking a moment to form her words with care. "I do not know. The notes suggest he was looking into something serious. But nothing here directly challenges the conclusion of an accident. Not yet." The uncertainty pressed against David's chest again. He wanted answers, but the pages only sharpened his questions. Sarah suggested bringing in someone with technical knowledge, someone who might understand the context behind the numbers and field notes. David already knew who that person should be. He drove across town to meet his former service brother, Mike Daniels. Mike lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of Murphy. He was a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with a rugged face defined by a strong jaw and a short beard sprinkled with gray. His hair was cut close, and his eyes were a deep steel blue, carrying the steady alertness of a man who had seen too much in war, but learned to live with the weight quietly. Mike opened the door with surprise etched on his face. "David, thought you were still in transit." David shook his hand firmly. "Needed to come home sooner than planned," he said. "I need your help." Inside, Mike cleared papers off the table and motioned for David to sit. Max lay near the door, watching both men with calm focus. David opened the notebook again, explaining everything found beneath the concrete. Mike listened carefully, his expression hardening as he skimmed through the notes. "These are soil readings," Mike said, running his finger across a line. "And these numbers do not look stable." He flipped to another section, his brow tightening. Some pages were damaged, the burn marks leaving only fragments. Mike looked at David, seriousness settling onto his features. "Your father was tracking changes in the land. Something was affecting the soil, something that should not happen naturally." David felt a cold ache stir inside him. "I do not know what he found, but this was hidden. Deep." Mike nodded, slowly tapping the page. "Greenfields makes fertilizers that claim to boost production. If something was going wrong with the land, these notes might be his attempt to document it. But nothing here proves wrongdoing. It only raises suspicion. That is not enough to challenge a fire report." David leaned back in the chair, his mind tightening around the empty spaces in the notebook. The more he learned, the more he felt his father had been searching for something important, something perhaps dangerous. But without the complete notes or clear explanations, there was nothing he could use. "The USB might have answers," he said. "But I have not opened it yet." Mike nodded. "Then that is where we should look next." But they both knew it would not be simple. David stared at the scattered pages again, seeing not just numbers, but hints of fear in the hurried handwriting and the damaged edges. His father had been under stress. The fragment suggested urgency, but not its cause. Rain struck the window lightly as clouds returned overhead, casting a dimmer light across the worn table. David felt a rising frustration inside him, mixed with grief. He had hoped the safe would hold clarity. Instead, it held only riddles. Sarah had seen concern in the data. Mike saw unnatural changes in the soil. Yet nothing pointed directly to the fire. The questions remained jagged and painful. Why had his father hidden these papers? Why had he been studying the land so intensely? And why had he died before finishing the message? Max nudged his leg, drawing him from his thoughts. The dog watched him with steady eyes, full of patience and quiet empathy. David placed a hand on Max's head, grounding himself in the moment. Sarah and Mike had confirmed only one thing. His father had been investigating something tied to the land and possibly to Greenfields. But the truth remained out of reach. David looked again at the notebook, then at the USB in his hand, feeling a mix of fear and determination. Whatever his father had discovered, this was only the beginning of uncovering it. The pieces were still scattered and incomplete, and nothing yet proved that the fire had been anything more than an accident. But the feeling inside David grew stronger, the same instinct that had kept him safe through years of deployment. Something was not right, and he needed to find out what it was. Night settled quietly over the outskirts of Murphy, with a thin blanket of clouds covering most of the sky. The air was cool and dry, and a pale moon cast a faint silver glow over the empty fields. The landscape felt still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. David Cooper stood beside his truck near the edge of a dirt road, his heart pressing tightly against his ribs. The weight of the notebook and the unanswered questions about his father pushed heavily on his mind. Tonight, he and Mike Daniels were taking a step that felt both necessary and dangerous. Mike stood a few feet away, checking the small flashlight in his hand. He wore a dark jacket and moved with the controlled calm of a man used to tense situations. His deep blue eyes reflected focus and experience sharpened by his years in the service. His broad shoulders and firm posture added a quiet strength to the moment. Max stayed close to David, the German shepherd's lean body shifting with alert anticipation. His ears stood up, eyes bright, scanning the darkness with instinctive precision. Since the discovery beneath the concrete, Max had changed. His loyalty was the same, but his awareness had sharpened, as if he knew each step brought them closer to what his former owner had feared. David looked at Mike and exhaled slowly. "You ready?" Mike nodded once. "If your father was tracking something dangerous, this is the place to start." They moved across the open field, approaching the back entrance of the Greenfield supply warehouse. The building stood tall and square, with metal siding reflecting faint moonlight. It looked plain on the outside, an ordinary agricultural storage facility with no reason to draw suspicion. But the notes from the safe suggested that something inside it held answers. The land was quiet, and no guards were visible. David and Mike had studied the layout earlier and knew only a few employees came at night and rarely checked the outer sections. Max went first, lowering his head and sniffing the air. David watched the dog move with silent caution, his paws barely disturbing the dirt. Max led them along the side of the building, stopping suddenly near an old fence. He sniffed again, then backed up slightly, turning to look at David with a soft wag as if confirming the path was safe. Mike nodded. "The dog is better than any map we could have had." David managed a faint smile, but worry tugged at him. He knew Max was smart enough to sense danger, but he also knew the risks of bringing him here. The thought of harm coming to the dog tightened something deep inside his chest. They reached a small service door at the back of the building. Mike examined the lock, then produced a thin metal tool from his pocket. Years in the military had given him more than combat training. He inserted the tool and worked silently. Within moments, the lock clicked and the door slid open with only a soft groan. Inside the warehouse, the air carried a chemical smell sharp and artificial. Large bags of agricultural materials were stacked in rows, forming narrow aisles of shadowed corridors. The place felt abandoned, yet watched at the same time. David kept close behind Max, while Mike watched their rear. Max sniffed the ground occasionally, lifting his head toward the left or right, guiding them deeper. After a few minutes, Max stopped at a metal cabinet pushed against the wall. His tail stiffened as he pressed his nose to the lower corner, then sat back and looked up at David. "This is it," Mike whispered. David stepped forward, opening the cabinet. Inside were several containers labeled with chemical codes. Mike examined the labels carefully, using his flashlight sparingly to avoid drawing attention. The codes matched the incomplete notes David had found in his father's notebook. One of the containers had the same sequence of numbers his father had written on 3 separate pages. The sight made David freeze as a rush of emotion hit him. His father had been here or had seen these exact materials before the fire. It was proof that his father had not been imagining anything. Something about these chemicals had concerned him enough to track their patterns and hide his findings in a fireproof safe. David lifted a sealed sample bag and held it to the light. The substance inside was pale and granular. It looked harmless, yet the air around it felt heavy. Mike leaned closer, studying the container and its printed details. This is definitely one of the compounds he wrote about. And if it behaves the way the notes suggest, it could damage soil faster than any natural process. David felt the truth shift painfully into place. His father had been investigating something real, something dangerous. But this discovery only deepened the mystery. It did not explain how the fire had started. It did not prove any connection to his father's death. It only confirmed that the man had been working to uncover something far bigger than himself. A faint noise echoed from the far end of the warehouse, a distant thud. Max snapped his head toward the sound muscles, tense and ready. David froze. His breath caught in his chest. Mike flicked off the flashlight and motioned for silence. After a long moment, the warehouse fell quiet again. No footsteps followed. No lights turned on. It was probably a door shifting in the wind, or a loose panel settling under the temperature drop. But the moment left tension in their thoughts. David placed the sample into his jacket pocket. "That is enough for tonight," he whispered. "We have something real now." They retraced their steps, Max guiding them once again, with deliberate care. The dog paused twice, listening, testing the air, then continued once he deemed it safe. When they finally slipped out into the night air, David felt his lungs loosen. The cool wind brushed against his face, washing away the chemical smell. Mike locked the service door again, and the 3 moved back across the field toward the truck. David looked at Max, whose fur rippled lightly under the breeze. The dog walked steadily by his side, showing no fear, only purpose. David rested his hand briefly on Max's back, gratitude tightening his throat. They had found something important, something his father had wanted to protect. It was not yet the truth behind the fire, but it was the first solid piece of the path toward it. The morning sky was gray and heavy with a stillness that settled over the valley like a thin blanket. The air felt cool and quiet, and the wind barely moved the dry grass along the roadside. David Cooper stood outside the warehouse with Max at his feet, both of them sensing that the calm around them did not match the tension forming inside the small town. Something had shifted overnight, something sharp enough to cut through the silence. When David drove into Murphy to meet Mike Daniels, the unease deepened. People gathered near the general store, speaking in low, hurried voices. Their expressions were tight, their movements restless. Mike waited for David beside his old truck. His jaw clenched, and his eyes narrowed the way they did when he encountered something he could not ignore. He handed David a folded paper. "They arrested Tom," he said. His voice was low but heavy. Claimed he had violated property laws. Claimed he had ignored citations. Claimed he had refused inspection. All of it sounds wrong. Tom Bell had been a farmer in the county for more than 20 years. He was a sturdy man in his 50s, with a sun-beaten face and dark hair streaked heavily with silver. His build was broad and strong, shaped by years of lifting feed bags and repairing fences. His eyes had always been steady, but a type of kindness that came from weathering hardship without allowing bitterness to settle. He was known for helping neighbors fix busted tractors without asking for payment and bringing food to families during harsh winters. If there was anyone in town who never looked for trouble, it was Tom. David felt a cold heaviness coil inside his chest. Tom was not the type of man to attract the law dust, and the timing made the situation unbearably clear. Mike looked toward the sheriff office across the street. Sheriff Dalton Reeves was moving between his car and the building, wearing a stiff expression. Dalton was a man in his late 50s, tall with a large frame softened by age. His hair was gray and trimmed short, and his thick mustache covered most of his upper lip. His face had deep lines around the eyes, but not from smiling. His gaze was often dismissive cold, even, and he carried himself with the authority of someone used to people stepping aside. Rumor in town said he had been under pressure from various outside groups over the years, and he had grown more distant, more strict, and more willing to bend rules for those who treated him well. He was talking to someone on the phone, gesturing sharply, as if the call irritated him. Mike followed David's eyes and nodded grimly. They are using him. Greenfields. They need to silence the town. Tom speaks up more than most, so they shut him down. The anger in David's chest rose, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. There was no proof strong enough yet. Only suspicion. Only fragments. Only fear filling the gaps. They returned to the warehouse, where the tension in the air felt sharper than before. Sarah had left earlier, leaving only a small note of concern written in her delicate handwriting. But another person was waiting inside. Emily Carter sat near a worn table, her laptop open in front of her. She was a young woman in her late 20s, small in frame, with short, dark brown hair cut above her shoulders and glasses that rested slightly crooked on her nose. Her skin was pale from long hours indoors, and her eyes were a deep, thoughtful brown. She moved with quick, precise gestures and carried the quiet but fierce energy of someone who spent most of her time solving problems that others considered impossible. Emily looked up as David and Mike entered. Her voice was soft but firm. "I heard about Tom. This is not random. This is planned." She pushed her glasses up with the back of her hand and turned her laptop so they could see. I started going through old data like you asked. Camera files, local server backups, anything I could recover from before the fire. David felt his pulse shift. He had asked for help, but had not expected so much progress so quickly. Emily tapped the keyboard and brought up an old street camera feed. The video was grainy, but clear enough to show David's father walking toward the county office carrying a stack of papers. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 2 days before the fire. "That is your father," she said. "And he was carrying a complaint form. I checked the county logs. The file is missing from the system now. Deleted. But you can see he went in with it." David leaned closer, feeling a slow numbness form in his hands. He watched the figure of his father, a tall man with steady posture, moving with purpose. He had been alive, determined, still fighting for something. Something tied to Greenfields. Emily pulled up another recovered fragment, a still image of a scanned document with burned edges. Most of it unreadable, but one line stood out. Formal complaint regarding soil contamination? David exhaled unsteadily. His father had tried to warn someone. He had gone through official channels, and now that document was gone. Emily spoke quietly. Someone erased it, and someone erased other files too. The system logs show manual deletions the day after the fire, and the login used belonged to the sheriff department. Mike cursed under his breath. They were covering tracks. David felt Max press gently against his leg, as if sensing the storm growing inside him. His father had been silenced before the truth was heard, and now Tom was being punished for speaking up. The threads were connecting in a way that made David's skin tighten. Emily continued, "The pieces fit together. Your father filed a complaint. The fire happened. The file was deleted. Now Greenfields is under pressure again, and the sheriff arrests Tom without real evidence. This is the first clear sign your father was targeted." The room felt unbearably still. Every breath David took seemed to echo in the empty space. The truth was not complete, but for the first time there was a path, a real one, a direction that pointed beyond accident, beyond coincidence, beyond assumption. David closed his hand into a fist and felt Max nuzzle his arm again, steadying him. The truth was no longer hidden beneath ash and silence. It was beginning to rise. The afternoon sky was pale with thin clouds drifting slowly across a soft blue horizon. The air was cool and still carrying the faint smell of dust that hovered above the dry fields. Inside the warehouse, David Cooper sat at the old table with Max resting quietly beside his chair. The hours had been long and heavy, and the silence around them carried a sense of anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath. David felt it deep in his chest, a mixture of dread and determination pushing against one another. Emily Carter sat across from him, her laptop open and several cables snaking across the worn wooden surface. She looked tired, but focused her dark brown eyes fixed on the screen as her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Her short, dark hair framed her pale, thoughtful face, and she kept adjusting her glasses with quick, nervous gestures. She had been digging through layers of digital records for hours, searching for the truth hidden behind corporate walls. Mike Daniels stood near the window, watching the road with his arms crossed. His tall, broad frame cast a long shadow across the floor. His expression was stern, the same expression he wore during tense moments in the field years ago. He trusted Emily, but the uncertainty of what they were about to uncover weighed heavily on him. Sarah Mitchell, the older lawyer with graying blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, sat near a stack of papers reviewing what they already knew. Her thin frame and calm manner gave her a steady presence, and her sharp blue eyes revealed a mind quick to piece things together. She had dedicated her life to helping families navigate difficult legal battles, and she now carried a personal responsibility toward David's case. The warehouse felt like a room suspended between two moments, the one before they learned the truth, and the one after, when nothing would be the same. Emily inhaled slowly, then spoke. "I have it." Her voice trembled slightly with the weight of what she had found. "I went deeper into their archive servers." Greenfields kept everything hidden behind encrypted partitions, but the old finance files, the emails, the soil reports, they were all still there, buried under renamed folders. David leaned forward, his heartbeat quickening. "Show me." Emily tapped a key, and the screen filled with rows of emails. The subject lines were simple, but cold, written in a tone that tried to hide the intent behind professional language. The first message displayed an exchange between a senior executive at Greenfields and Sheriff Dalton Reeves. The message read, in a chillingly calm tone, that the situation with the farmer gathering unauthorized soil samples needed to be handled quickly. The phrasing was vague, but the implication was unmistakable. The sheriff had been notified that someone threatened to interfere with the company's plans. Emily opened another document, one showing financial transfers. Payments were issued from shell companies linked to Greenfields, then funneled into accounts associated with the sheriff office. The amounts were modest, but regular enough to reveal their purpose. The truth settled over the room like a shadow stretching across the floor. Mike cursed under his breath, anger tightening his features. They paid him to silence opposition. They paid him to shut down anyone who questioned their product. Emily nodded, her eyes darkening with frustration. There is more, much more. She opened a scanned internal report. It included detailed notes about the soil conditions linked to the Greenfields fertilizer formula. According to the data, the product was designed in a way that slowly drained the land of its nutrients, causing long-term degradation. It forced farmers to become dependent on the company's chemical line in order to keep producing crops. Most farmers had given up and sold their land after their yields collapsed. They had believed it was a natural failure, but David's father had not accepted that explanation. He had taken soil samples, kept detailed notes, and filed a complaint. He had been the only one in town willing to challenge the company. Emily brought up the final document, a draft message from a Greenfields executive. It referenced a meeting between David's father and the sheriff. The document stated that if the farmer continued pushing for an investigation, they would face consequences. The message ended with a disturbing line that the issue would be resolved soon. Sarah spoke quietly but firmly. "This is clear evidence. They viewed your father as a threat. He was going to expose what their product was doing. They needed to stop him before he completed his report." David stared at the screen, a slow heaviness building behind his ribs. The image of his father alive, committed, and determined filled his mind. He remembered the quiet strength in the man and the way he always fought for what was right, even when it cost him. Realizing that he was targeted brought a pain sharp enough to steal David's breath. Max nudged David's knee, sensing the rise of emotion. The dog's warm presence rooted him in the moment, allowing him to breathe again. David placed a hand gently on Mac's head, feeling the steadiness the dog provided. Emily opened one final image. It was a fire analysis originally classified as internal use only. The file noted signs of accelerants and irregular burn patterns at the Cooper farm. These details had never been included in the official report. Emily looked at David, her voice steady but full of sympathy. They covered up everything. They made the fire look like an accident. They deleted your father's complaint, and they paid the sheriff to close the case before anyone asked questions. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one needed to say anything. The truth was clear. The cause of death had never been accidental. It had been deliberate, calculated, and hidden behind ashes and smoke. David closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Grief and anger twisted together inside him, but beneath both emotions rose something steadier and stronger. Resolve. His father had died trying to protect the land and the people who depended on it. And now the truth was finally in the open. He opened his eyes and spoke with a calm, firm voice. Now we know. Now we act. Max pressed against him, as if agreeing. Sarah looked at David with a mixture of sorrow and respect. The truth has a cost, David, but you have faced it with courage. Your father would be proud. Mike stepped closer, his voice steady. This changes everything. We can show the town. We can show everyone. Emily closed her laptop and exhaled sharply. It is all here. Every secret. Every step. They cannot hide this anymore. David stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over his shoulders, but also sensing a lightness beneath it. A door had opened the door his father had died trying to reach. Now it was David's turn to walk through it. The chapter of doubt was ending. The chapter of truth had begun. The morning sun rose gently over the quiet valley, casting a warm, soft glow across the fields. The sky was clear and pale blue, with a thin line of golden light stretching along the horizon. A calm breeze moved across the land, carrying the scent of fresh soil and new grass. It was the kind of morning that made change feel possible, and it wrapped the world in a sense of quiet hope. David Cooper stood outside the warehouse, with Max sitting beside him, the dog breathing steadily, as if sensing the shift in the air. The past days had unfolded with a speed that left David in a lingering haze of disbelief and relief. Once Emily Carter finished assembling the digital evidence, Sarah Mitchell had taken the organized documents straight to the courthouse. Sarah, with her composed presence and sharp blue eyes, had spoken firmly about the urgency of the case and the weight of the material they carried. She had long gray streaks in her blonde hair, and her slender frame moved with a dignified determination shaped by decades of courtroom battles. Her calm professional nature now served as the guiding force that carried their evidence into the legal arena. The judge who reviewed the documents was a middle-aged man named Harold Barnes. He had a tall, lean build, a clean-shaven face, and short brown hair with touches of silver near the temples. His expression was serious and disciplined, shaped by years of presiding over difficult rural cases. Judge Barnes was known for being fair and steady, a man who approached every file with the same measured attention. When he saw the full extent of the Greenfields' corruption, his normally reserved expression hardened. He ordered an immediate transfer of the evidence to federal authorities, understanding the magnitude of what they had uncovered. 2 days later, federal agents arrived, moving quietly but efficiently. They were not dramatic in appearance, wearing simple jackets and plain expressions, but their presence carried a gravity that made the town fall silent. Within hours, Greenfield's headquarters was searched from top to bottom, and the CEO, a man named Leonard Briggs, was taken into custody. Briggs was in his late 50s, with a polished appearance, dark gray suit, perfectly tailored, and silver hair combed precisely to the side. His public image had always been one of confidence and charm, but the reports later described him as pale, tense, and speechless when confronted with the list of charges. He was arrested for environmental crimes, conspiracy fraud, and obstruction. Sheriff Dalton Reeves was arrested soon after. The former authority figure, who had once walked through town with stiff pride, was now seen with slumped shoulders and a hollow gaze. His gray hair looked messier than usual, and his mustache drooped slightly, as if weighed down by guilt. For years, he had traded integrity for comfort, and now, every step he took toward the waiting car felt like a step into a future he could not escape. The town watched in silence, some with anger, some with disappointment, and some with quiet relief. News spread quickly across the farming community. The land that had been suffering for so long was now acknowledged as a victim rather than a failure. Federal investigations confirmed the soil contamination. Compensation funds were approved. Greenfield's assets were ordered to be liquidated and a portion dedicated to restoration efforts. For the first time in years, there was a path toward healing. David felt a slow, heavy weight lift from his chest. The truth about his father had been buried under ashes and fear, but now it stood in the open, undeniable, and recognized. His father had not fought in vain. His note samples and determination had been the foundation for everything that followed. And David himself had carried that mission to its final point, supported by people who believed in justice. Weeks passed, and the land gradually began to change. With new treatment programs and support from environmental experts, patches of green returned to the fields. The air smelled fresher, and the soil felt softer. Farmers who once stood helpless now worked with renewed purpose, their hands moving with the confidence of people who felt seen and supported. The compensation they received allowed them to repair their barns, replace equipment, and return to work with dignity. David used part of his settlement money to rebuild the old Cooper farm. The new house stood modest and sturdy, with wide windows that welcomed the morning light. The fences were repaired, the barn roof replaced, and the fields tilled again with care. Beside the house, he built a small office for the Cooper Support Fund, a project Sarah helped him establish. The fund provided assistance to struggling farmers and counseling and job placement support for veterans trying to rebuild their lives. David wanted to honor his father's memory, not only through his own land, but by helping others find stability. Max moved across the revived fields with renewed strength. His fur had grown darker and thicker, his once tired eyes bright again. He walked with a proud, steady gait, and every farmer in town recognized him as the dog who helped uncover the truth. Children often ran up to pet him, and adults greeted him with soft smiles. Max became a symbol of loyalty, a living reminder of how courage sometimes came from the most unexpected places. One late afternoon, David walked to the edge of his land. The sun was warm low in the sky, painting the hills in deep gold. A soft wind moved across the grass, making it sway gently like an ocean of green. David stood still, feeling the quiet peace that surrounded him. Max sat beside him, leaning lightly against his leg, as if sharing the moment. David looked over the fields that were once gray and lifeless, now alive again with promise. His father had believed this land could be saved, and he had been right. The truth had been painful, and the path to justice long, but standing there now, David felt a deep calm settle in his heart. He reached down and placed his hand on Max's head. The warm fur beneath his palm felt grounding and real. Max lifted his gaze steady and bright. The dog had guided him through darkness, had sensed the hidden clues, and had stayed close through every moment of doubt. David spoke quietly, letting the wind carry the words across the field. "We did it, boy." Max thumped his tail softly against the grass. Justice had been restored. The land was healing. The community was stronger. And David Cooper no longer stood alone in grief, but in renewal, filled with gratitude for the loyal companion who had led him to the truth. In the quiet return of green fields and the steady healing of a wounded community, the story of David and Max becomes more than a journey for justice. It shows how one heart full of courage and one loyal companion can awaken strength in others. Lives can be broken by loss and deceit, yet also rebuilt by truth and unity. Every hand that helped, every voice that stood up, and every moment of faith turned a tragedy into a path filled with hope. Just as the land finds its way back to life, hearts can too. At the end of every long night, there is a light waiting. Some call it grace. Some call it a miracle. Many believe it is the gentle work of God guiding people toward what is right. As you go through your own days, may this story remind you that no act of kindness is wasted and no battle for truth is ever fought alone. If this journey touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to join our growing community. And may God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and protection in every step ahead.